For over 30 years, the murder of 4 teenage girls in Austin haunted a city and a nation. Now, decades later, investigators believe they finally know who carried out the yogurt shop murders. On the night of December 6, 1991, 4 teenage girls spent their final hours inside a small frozen yogurt shop in Austin, Texas. Jennifer Harbison, 17, and her close friend Eliza Thomas, also 17, were assigned to close the shop. I can't believe it's yogurt. It was routine work, the kind of responsibility that came with part-time jobs, and nothing seemed unusual at first. Jennifer's younger sister, Sarah, 15, and Jennifer's friend Amy Ayers, 13, stopped by to keep them company. For the 4 girls, it was supposed to be a simple Friday night. As the evening wore on, customers came and went until the doors were locked. The girls stayed inside, chatting and helping with the closing duties. At approximately 11:47 p.m., the Austin Fire Department received an emergency call reporting smoke and flames coming from the shop. Crews arrived quickly, expecting to battle an ordinary fire in a small retail business. What they found instead would shake the city to its core. Inside, firefighters discovered the charred remains of the 4 girls. Each had been bound and gagged before being shot execution style in the back of the store. The killers had set the building ablaze in a clear attempt to destroy evidence, leaving behind a crime scene both horrific and complicated. The youngest victim, Amy Ayers, had been shot twice, a detail suggesting she may have still been alive after the first bullet. Word of the tragedy spread through Austin overnight. The brutality, combined with the youth of the victims, left families devastated and a community in disbelief. Instantly, the case became one of the most disturbing and haunting crimes in Texas history. Jennifer Harbison was 17 years old, a responsible and caring young woman who balanced school with her part-time job at the yogurt shop. Friends describe her as mature beyond her age, someone who looked after her younger sister and often put others before herself. She had dreams of working in animal science, a field that reflected her gentle and nurturing spirit. Her younger sister, Sarah Harbison, was just 15. Sarah was bright, outgoing, and full of energy. She was the kind of teenager who loved spending time with her friends, sharing secrets and planning for the future. On that December evening, Sarah was supposed to sleep over at a friend's house, a simple plan that underscored how ordinary the night was meant to be. Eliza Thomas, also 17, worked alongside Jennifer that night. Eliza was friendly, responsible, and well-liked at school. She had a passion for music and loved spending afternoons with her close group of friends. Her family remembered her as someone with a warm laugh who could brighten any room. The youngest of the group, Amy Ayers, was only 13 years old. She was adventurous and cheerful, with a love for animals and a curiosity about the world. Amy was Sarah's friend and had tagged along to the shop before the sleepover. Together, the 4 girls represented promise, innocence, and youth. Their lives were filled with the everyday joys and dreams of teenagers, until the night that promise was stolen forever. When police arrived at the yogurt shop, they were confronted with a scene that was both horrifying and confusing. The fire had not only taken the lives of 4 young girls, but it also destroyed much of the physical evidence that could have explained what happened. Burned debris covered the floor, and crucial forensic traces, fingerprints, footprints, or DNA, was likely lost in the flames. Investigators began working around the clock, piecing together what little they could from the ashes. In the first days and weeks, detectives interviewed hundreds of people, from nearby residents to former employees. Yet, despite the scale of the effort, no clear suspects emerged. The lack of solid leads quickly became a source of frustration, both for law enforcement and for a community desperate for answers. The handling of the crime scene soon came under criticism. Some questioned whether vital clues had been overlooked or mishandled in the rush to control the blaze and secure the area. These doubts cast a shadow over the early stages of the investigation and would haunt the case for years to come. Meanwhile, fear spread across Austin. Parents became more protective, watching their children closely. Local businesses, shaken by the brutality of the crime, began closing earlier than usual. The city was on edge, and the pressure on police to solve the case grew heavier with each passing day. 8 years passed without solid answers. Then, in 1999, Austin police announced what seemed like a breakthrough. For young men, Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Maurice Pierce, and Forrest Wellborn were arrested in connection with the yogurt shop murders. For a city haunted by the tragedy, the news felt like long-awaited justice. Maurice Pierce had been on investigators' radar from the very beginning. Shortly after the murders, he was stopped carrying a gun similar to the one believed to have been used in the crime. However, he was released due to lack of evidence. Years later, as pressure to solve the case intensified, detectives returned to Pierce and the circle of friends he associated with. This time, their approach was more aggressive. Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen soon became the focus. After hours of intense interrogation, both men gave confessions describing their alleged roles in the murders. But these confessions were troubling. They contradicted one another in key details, and both men later claimed they had been coerced, saying detectives fed them information and pushed them into telling a story that was not true. Despite the absence of physical evidence directly linking the suspects to the crime scene, prosecutors moved forward. In 2001, Robert Springsteen was convicted and sentenced to death. 1 year later, Michael Scott received a life sentence. The cases against Pierce and Wellborn, however, were eventually dropped due to insufficient evidence. Public reaction was deeply divided. Some families and residents felt relief, believing justice had finally been served. Others, disturbed by the reliance on contested confessions, feared the real killers were still out there. The arrests and convictions brought closure for some, but for many, they opened new questions about truth, fairness, and whether justice had truly been done. As forensic technology improved in the years following convictions, DNA testing offered a new way to re-examine the evidence from the yogurt shop murders. Biological samples collected at the scene were analyzed with advanced methods unavailable in the early 1990s. The results were startling. None of the 4 men convicted, Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Maurice Pierce, or Forrest Wellborn, matched the DNA profiles recovered from the victims. This revelation shook the foundations of the case. For nearly a decade, the prosecution had relied heavily on the disputed confessions of Scott and Springsteen, but the absence of physical evidence linking them to the crime scene now raised serious doubts. Defense attorneys argued that the convictions were unsafe, and appeals courts agreed. In 2009, Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott were both released after their convictions were overturned. The charges against Maurice Pierce and Forrest Wellborn had already been dismissed, meaning that all 4 original suspects were ultimately cleared of responsibility. For the families of Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy, the news was deeply painful. On one hand, it meant that innocent men were no longer condemned for crimes they did not commit. On the other, it underscored the grim truth that the real killer or killers had never been caught. The reversal reopened wounds that had never truly healed, and with it came a profound sense of injustice. The developments left Austin reeling. Confidence in the justice system was shaken, and the community was forced to confront the haunting reality that, despite years of trials and investigations, the case remained unsolved. After the convictions were overturned, the yogurt shop murders entered a new and painful chapter. For years, the case remained one of Austin's most haunting cold cases. Detectives refused to let it fade, revisiting the evidence again and again as forensic science advanced. Each round of testing carried the hope that new breakthroughs might finally identify the unknown male whose DNA had been found at the scene. Yet, every attempt ended in disappointment. The case never drifted far from public memory. Billboards across Austin displayed the victims' faces, reminding the community that justice had not yet been served. Media outlets regularly revisited the story, and national television programs examined the tragedy for wider audiences. $25,000 reward was offered for information, an incentive meant to draw out hidden truths. But despite these efforts, no conclusive leads emerged. The investigation drew in not only Austin police, but also the FBI and Texas Rangers. Periodically, task forces reopened the files, interviewing new witnesses, re-examining old ones, and analyzing the smallest fragments of evidence. Yet the critical question, whose DNA was left behind, remained unanswered. Over time, the case became more than just a local tragedy. It stood as a symbol of perseverance, demonstrating the relentless pursuit of justice. But it was also a stark reminder of the justice system's limitations. showing how even high-profile cases could remain unsolved despite decades of effort, advanced science, and unyielding determination. In 2025, more than 3 decades after the yogurt shop murders, investigators finally announced a breakthrough. Through the use of advanced genetic genealogy, the male DNA profile recovered from the crime scene was conclusively matched to Robert Eugene Brasher's, a convicted criminal and known serial offender who had died by suicide in 1999. Brasher's had lived a violent double life. To neighbors, he appeared as a quiet family man, but his hidden history revealed a trail of brutality stretching across several states. In 1990, he murdered a young woman in South Carolina. 7 years later, in 1997, he committed a brutal rape in Tennessee. In 1998, he killed a mother and daughter in Missouri before vanishing once again into obscurity. Each crime shared common patterns: calculated attacks, shocking violence, and a determination to leave as little evidence as possible. Authorities had long suspected Brasher's in unsolved cases, but only with the rise of forensic genealogy could those suspicions be confirmed. The match to the Austin case finally explained the presence of the unidentified male DNA that had confounded investigators for years. For families of Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy, the revelation brought long-awaited answers, but also profound sorrow. Brasher's could never be prosecuted, leaving justice incomplete. The truth illuminated the scale of his crimes, but his death in 1999 closed the door on accountability. Still, the identification marked an extraordinary triumph for forensic science. It proved how determination, evolving technology, and modern investigative techniques could reach across decades to expose the truth. The yogurt shop murders had at last been tied to their true perpetrator, transforming a case once defined by doubt into one with resolution, though not closure. While cases like the yogurt shop murders captured national attention, tragedies also unfold in quieter towns. One such case occurred in Magnolia, Delaware, where a family faced an unimaginable loss. Now, we turn our focus to the story of Dorothy Donovan and the events that changed her family forever. Dorothy Mae Donovan was a 70-year-old woman living in Magnolia, Delaware, at the time of her death on June 22, 1991. She was remembered as kind, gentle, and energetic, with a personality centered on family and faith. Friends and relatives described her as someone who always gave her time to others, embodying warmth and generosity in her daily life. Her days were filled with activities that reflected her love of home and family. She enjoyed gardening, where she carefully tended to flowers and vegetables. She also spent hours canning vegetables, a skill that connected her to earlier traditions of family living. Dorothy found joy in babysitting her grandchildren, strengthening bonds across generations. Sundays and church events were a steady part of her life, reinforcing her deep faith and sense of community. Dorothy had experienced significant loss, being twice widowed. Despite grief, she remained resilient and dedicated to her children. She raised 3 grown children: Charles Holden, Brenda Alexander, and Diana Reinhardt. Each remembered her as a source of constant support. Dorothy lived in the Donovan farmhouse, situated on the family's 163-acre property near Harrington, Delaware. Though she lived alone, she was never far from her loved ones. Her son Charles lived nearby in a trailer on the same land, where he worked for the DuPont Company factory. This proximity allowed mother and son to maintain a close daily connection. The farmhouse and surrounding property represented stability and history for the Donovan family. Dorothy's life reflected quiet strength, simple joys, and devotion to those around her. She had no known enemies and lived peacefully, rooted in family and faith. These details made the violent end she would later suffer all the more shocking and tragic. On the night of June 22, 1991, Charles Holden finished his factory shift and stopped at a Hardee's restaurant for food. While there, a man he had never seen before approached him. The stranger claimed his sister had just given birth at Milford Memorial Hospital and asked for a ride. Charles hesitated, feeling uneasy, but the man insisted. Eventually, Charles agreed to drive him part of the way, hoping to help without straying too far from his route home. They traveled toward Milford until Charles reached Killen Pond Road. There, he attempted to let the man out, pointing to a nearby phone booth where the stranger could call for further assistance. Instead of leaving, the man grew angry and refused to get out of the truck. Suddenly, he turned violent, punching Charles and demanding control of the vehicle. A scuffle broke out inside the truck, during which the stranger grabbed a screwdriver from the cab, escalating the confrontation into a life-threatening struggle. Charles managed to break free and fled on foot to Blake's garage nearby, seeking help. The man pursued him, still armed with a screwdriver, and threatened him again. Thinking quickly, Charles outmaneuvered the attacker, darted back to his truck, and drove away before the man could stop him. When Charles returned to the family property, he was shaken but hoped the ordeal was over. To his horror, he saw the same man lurking around his trailer, peering through windows in the darkness. Terrified, Charles called police at 1:19 a.m. He also tried phoning his mother, Dorothy, multiple times, but she did not answer. Unfortunately, responding officers categorized the call as low priority. Their delayed arrival left Dorothy Donovan alone, vulnerable, and unaware of the imminent danger that now threatened her life. At approximately 3 a.m. on June 23, 1991, Corporal Myrna Williams Kinney met Charles Holden after his distress call. They first examined his trailer, searching for signs of intrusion. No windows or doors had been disturbed, and there was no indication the attacker had entered. The focus then shifted to Dorothy Donovan's farmhouse, located nearby on the same property. As they approached, a troubling sign appeared. A back window had been broken, suggesting forced entry. Inside the house, the silence was heavy. Charles moved upstairs with the officer close behind. In one of the rooms, he made the devastating discovery. His 70-year-old mother lay motionless. Dorothy had been brutally attacked. She had suffered more than 24 stab wounds concentrated on her face, arms, and chest. The level of violence shocked investigators, revealing the ferocity of the assault. Equally significant were the details that did not fit common criminal patterns. Dorothy's purse remained untouched, and no valuables were missing from the farmhouse. Investigators quickly ruled out robbery as a motive. There was also no evidence of sexual assault. Instead, the scene suggested a random and senseless act of violence committed against a woman who had no known enemies. Later analysis indicated that Dorothy's life ended around 1 a.m., the same time Charles had been struggling with a stranger on Killen Pond Road and seeking help. The timing deepened the tragedy, as Dorothy had been alone and vulnerable. Family members explained that she often stayed awake until Charles returned home, keeping watch for him out of care and routine. This habit, normally a sign of her devotion, may have left her awake when the intruder entered. The randomness of the murder and the brutality of the attack intensified the profound sense of injustice surrounding her death. In the early stages of the investigation, attention turned directly toward Dorothy Donovan's son, Charles Holden. As the last family member to see Dorothy alive and a man who admitted to a violent encounter with a stranger that same night, he became the primary focus. Detectives doubted aspects of his account, questioning how a hitchhiker dropped off on Killen Pond Road could have arrived so quickly at Dorothy's farmhouse. The unusual sequence of events invited scrutiny. Investigators uncovered additional reasons for concern. They learned Dorothy had recently taken out a life insurance policy naming Charles as the beneficiary. Coupled with knowledge of his financial difficulties, this discovery fueled speculation about motive. When Charles declined to take a polygraph test, suspicion grew stronger. Some detectives even entertained the theory that he might have arranged for the hitchhiker to stage an attack. Despite this, evidence and witness statements steadily worked in Charles's favor. Employees at Hardee's confirmed that a stranger had approached him at the restaurant and left in his truck. Other witnesses recalled the altercation at the intersection, and even reported seeing a man lurking near Charles's trailer afterward. Physical injuries, including bruises on his face and burns from spilled coffee, supported his description of the assault. Most crucially, forensic evidence from a farmhouse pointed away from Charles. A bloody palm print found at the crime scene, and DNA samples did not match him. These findings directly contradicted theories of his involvement. Although eventually cleared, Charles endured years of suspicion, mistrust, and public doubt. Investigators had weighed circumstantial motives against hard physical evidence, but the shadow of accusation lingered over him long after his mother's death. His eventual exoneration underscored the challenges of balancing investigative pressure with factual proof. For many years after Dorothy Donovan's murder, the investigation stalled. Detectives possessed crucial pieces of forensic evidence, including a bloody palm print and DNA collected from the farmhouse, yet the attacker's identity remained elusive. Without a database to compare the samples against, the case slowly went cold. Charles Holden, though cleared, continued to live under the shadow of suspicion, and Dorothy's family had no answers. By the early 2000s, advances in forensic science began to change the landscape of criminal investigations. The Combined DNA Index System, known as CODIS, created a centralized database where law enforcement agencies could upload and compare genetic profiles. Delaware authorities preserved the evidence from Dorothy's case carefully, ensuring it could be tested when new technology became available. In November 2005, a breakthrough occurred. The preserved DNA from the farmhouse matched a profile in CODIS belonging to 41-year-old Gilbert E. Cannon of Del Mar, Maryland. Cannon's palm print was also compared against a bloody impression left at the crime scene, and it matched precisely. After years of uncertainty, investigators finally had a definitive link between Dorothy's murder and a named suspect. Cannon's background painted a picture of a dangerous man. He had an extensive criminal history that included robbery, assault, burglary, and even a prior slaying. He had served 7 years in prison, and just before his 2004 release, his DNA was collected and entered into CODIS. That routine process ultimately connected him to Dorothy's case. When investigators compared photographs of Cannon to the composite sketch created in 1991, the resemblance was striking. The identification highlighted the importance of meticulous evidence preservation and the power of modern forensic science. More than a decade after Dorothy's death, technology delivered long-awaited answers, proving that even cold cases could be solved with persistence and innovation. After Gilbert E. Cannon was identified as Dorothy Donovan's killer, investigators moved to bring him into custody. For a time, he evaded capture, but on January 18, 2006, authorities located him at his girlfriend's house. Hiding in the basement, Cannon was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, burglary, and possession of a deadly weapon. Initially, he denied any involvement, but the weight of forensic evidence left little room for denial. When confronted with a DNA match and palm print, Cannon confessed. He explained that on the night of June 22, 1991, he had been high on drugs. His impaired state fueled the violent confrontation with Charles Holden after Charles refused to drive him further. Armed with a screwdriver taken from Charles's truck, Cannon pursued his own path once Charles escaped. He eventually wandered onto the Donovan property and entered Dorothy's farmhouse, believing it to be empty. Inside, Cannon unexpectedly encountered Dorothy. He later admitted that he killed her out of fear she could identify him. He stabbed her repeatedly with a screwdriver, ending her life in a frenzied act of violence. Cannon insisted the choice of house was coincidental and that he had no prior knowledge it belonged to Charles's mother. The explanation underscored the randomness and senselessness of the crime, deepening the tragedy. On April 24, 2007, Cannon pleaded guilty to the charges and received a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For Dorothy's family, the resolution brought a measure of relief but also renewed heartbreak. While justice had finally been served, the loss remained permanent. Cannon's troubled criminal history and reckless violence had shattered a family and community, leaving behind sorrow that no sentence could fully repair. The impact of Dorothy Donovan's murder weighed heavily on her family for decades. Charles Holden described the tragedy as a nightmare that sometimes felt unreal, a wound he could never fully escape. Brenda Alexander reflected that her mother had been her best friend, someone whose absence she still felt every day. For Diana Reinhardt, the loss carried a distinct pain. She explained that losing a parent to violence was far harder to accept than losing one naturally. The case strained family bonds in the years that followed. Resentment lingered over Charles's decision to give Gilbert Cannon a ride that night, a choice Brenda and Diana struggled to forgive. For a long time, the siblings did not speak, their grief compounded by division. Only after Cannon entered a guilty plea and the truth of his responsibility was undeniable did the family begin to rebuild fractured connections. The reconciliation was partial, as Diana sadly passed away in 2020, leaving Brenda and Charles to carry the memory forward. Dorothy's case also left a broader legacy. It demonstrated the fragility of safety, even in quiet rural communities where violence felt distant. At the same time, it underscored the vital role of modern forensic science in solving cold cases, proving that justice could be delivered long after hope seemed lost. Beyond the crime itself, Dorothy's life remained defined by love, faith, and family. Her children remembered her warmth, devotion, and constant care. In telling her story, she is honored not just as a victim, but as a mother whose enduring love continues to shape the lives she touched. While the Donovan case shocked the community, other tragedies were unfolding across the country. One such heartbreaking story took place in Hammond, Indiana, involving a young mother-to-be. Rochelle Stubblefield's disappearance would soon captivate investigators and alter her family's life forever. On November 10, 2015, 20-year-old Rochelle Thomas Stubblefield disappeared without a trace. She was a criminal justice student at Calumet College of St. Joseph in Hammond, Indiana, and was known for her ambition and dedication to her studies. Rochelle had plans to pursue a career in law enforcement, and she was just weeks away from welcoming her first child. At the time, she was 8 months pregnant and had already chosen a name for her son, Amir Deshaun Thomas Stubblefield. That evening, Rochelle attended a basketball game at her college. It was an ordinary outing, and there was no indication of what was about to unfold. After leaving the game, Rochelle vanished. She did not return home, and she failed to respond to calls or messages from her family. This was completely uncharacteristic of her, especially given her pregnancy and close bond with her loved ones. Concern grew rapidly, and when 2 days passed without any word, her mother officially reported her missing on November 12th. Police treated the disappearance with urgency. The circumstances immediately raised alarm because Rochelle was responsible, attentive, and in the final stages of her pregnancy. Detectives began searching for clues, and soon they made a grim discovery. Rochelle's car was found abandoned in Gary, Indiana. Inside, investigators recovered her broken eyeglasses, and nearby they located a pair of red and black shoes believed to be hers. These findings suggested foul. From the outset of the investigation, police began to focus their attention on Rochelle Stubblefield's boyfriend, Darren Fuller. Although Rochelle was 8 months pregnant and had told her mother she was going to meet Fuller about the baby on the night she disappeared, Fuller denied that he had any relationship with her. He also insisted that the unborn child was not his. These denials contradicted what Rochelle had shared with her family and fueled early suspicions about his possible involvement. Detectives questioned Fuller, but he continued to distance himself from Rochelle. His inconsistent statements raised further doubts about his credibility. Investigators knew Rochelle's sudden disappearance, combined with the discovery of her abandoned car, her broken eyeglasses, and a pair of red and black shoes, pointed toward foul play. However, at that time in 2015, the evidence available was limited. Without a body and lacking physical proof directly linking Fuller to her disappearance, authorities faced a difficult challenge in advancing the case. Court records later revealed that Rochelle had been in contact with her mother just before she vanished, specifically mentioning plans to see Fuller to discuss the pregnancy. This communication strongly suggested that she intended to meet him, yet Fuller continued to deny any connection. The contradiction between Rochelle's message and Fuller's claims only deepened police suspicion. Despite these red flags, the investigation struggled to move forward. The absence of concrete forensic evidence or eyewitness accounts hindered progress. Although Fuller remained a person of interest, detectives could not yet prove his involvement. In the early stages, the case hovered in uncertainty, with investigators aware that something sinister had likely occurred but unable to firmly establish Fuller's role in Rochelle's disappearance. In the months following Rochelle Stubblefield's disappearance, police pursued numerous leads, but each effort ended in frustration. Searches were conducted in and around Gary, Indiana, including areas identified as possible sites connected to her last known movements. Despite these efforts, no trace of Rochelle or her unborn child was ever located. The lack of evidence left investigators unable to establish what happened to her or where she might be. Her due date eventually arrived and passed in silence. For her family, This absence was devastating. They had expected to welcome both Rochelle and her baby into a new chapter of life, but instead they faced uncertainty and fear. Family members and friends continued to push for answers, attending vigils and maintaining public attention on the case. Yet progress was painfully slow. For authorities, the lack of physical evidence presented a significant obstacle. The abandoned vehicle, broken eyeglasses, and scattered shoes pointed toward violence. But these clues alone were insufficient to prove who was responsible. Detectives were unable to build a case strong enough to move forward, and without a body, the investigation reached a standstill. During these years of inactivity, Fuller moved on with his life. He eventually relocated to Kentucky, where he became stationed at Fort Knox as part of the U.S. Army. While he pursued a military career, Rochelle's loved ones endured the unrelenting weight of uncertainty. Each passing year deepened their pain, as the unanswered questions about her disappearance remained. For the family, these years offered no closure, only silence and sorrow. By 2019, nearly 4 years after Rochelle Stubblefield vanished, investigators returned to the case with renewed determination. Detectives re-interviewed individuals connected to Darren Fuller, hoping fresh conversations might reveal information that had previously been withheld or overlooked. Their persistence paid off. One woman, who had been involved with Fuller around the time of Rochelle's disappearance, provided a critical breakthrough. She told police that Fuller had directly admitted to killing Rochelle. According to her statement, he confessed to strangling Rochelle during an argument. She further revealed that he described discarding Rochelle's belongings by throwing them out his car window near the location where her abandoned vehicle was found. Fuller allegedly went even further, saying that he had buried her body near an elementary school in Gary. As detectives pursued this lead, additional witnesses began to step forward. Fuller's own relatives came forward with information that reinforced claims. One cousin recalled Fuller admitting that he killed Rochelle because he did not want to pay child support. The cousin stated Fuller described strangling Rochelle and stabbing her in the head before disposing of her body. These accounts, though harrowing, created a consistent picture of what might have happened in 2015. Armed with these revelations, investigators conducted searches near the elementary school. Canine units indicated possible traces of human remains, but despite multiple attempts, no body was recovered. Even so, the consistency of the witness statements gave prosecutors the foundation they needed. For the first time since Rochelle's disappearance, the case had gained solid momentum, moving closer to holding Fuller accountable despite the absence of physical remains. In July 2020, nearly 5 years after the disappearance of Rochelle Stubblefield, investigators made their move. They traveled to Fort Knox, Kentucky, where Darren Fuller was stationed with the U.S. Army. When police confronted him with the charges, reports stated that Fuller fainted, collapsing under the weight of the moment. After regaining consciousness, he was taken into custody and prepared for extradition. Fuller was transported back to Indiana to face charges. Prosecutors filed 2 counts of murder, one for Rochelle and one for her unborn son, Amir. An additional charge of obstruction of justice was also included, reflecting his alleged efforts to cover up the crime and mislead investigators. The filing of dual murder charges underscored the gravity of the case, acknowledging both Rochelle's life and the life of her unborn child. During the preliminary hearings, a judge entered not guilty pleas on Fuller's behalf. He continued to deny any involvement in Rochelle's disappearance, maintaining his position that she had fabricated their relationship and falsely claimed he was the father of her child. His defense attempted to frame the accusations as unreliable, relying on the absence of a body and the circumstantial nature of the evidence. Despite his denials, prosecutors pressed forward. They emphasized the consistency of the multiple witness statements, Fuller's reported admissions to relatives and acquaintances, and the circumstantial evidence that pointed to his role. Though the lack of physical remains posed challenges, authorities believed they had assembled a strong case. By 2020, after years of silence and uncertainty, the stage was finally set for trial. Prosecutors were determined to secure justice for Rochelle and Amir, even without the recovery of their remains. In April 2023, after years of delays and anticipation, the case of Rochelle Stubblefield's disappearance finally went before a Lake County jury. Prosecutors laid out their narrative with precision, focusing heavily on the testimony of multiple witnesses who recall Fuller admitting to the crime. They argued that his motive stemmed from a desire to avoid fatherhood and the financial responsibilities of child support. This reasoning, they explained, made Rochelle and her unborn son targets of his desperation. The defense countered by attempting to discredit the prosecution's witnesses, portraying them as unreliable or motivated by self-interest. They emphasized the glaring absence of physical evidence, especially the fact that Rochelle's body had never been recovered. Without forensic proof, they argued, the case rested on shaky ground and should not meet the burden of guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Despite these efforts, the prosecution's methodical presentation carried weight. Jurors heard repeated accounts of Fuller's alleged confessions, each retelling reinforcing the consistency of his admissions, coupled with the circumstantial evidence that painted a picture of his actions before and after Rochelle's disappearance. The narrative proved compelling. The jury ultimately returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. 2 counts of murder, 1 for Rochelle and 1 for her unborn son Amir, as well as obstruction of justice. The outcome underscored that a case can succeed without a body when supported by strong testimony and carefully woven evidence. Fuller was sentenced to 95 years in prison, a punishment that effectively ensured he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The disappearance and murder of Rochelle Stubblefield left a profound and lasting impact on her family. Her mother, Thelma Thomas, had always described Rochelle as a bright, ambitious student with a clear vision for a future in law enforcement. Losing her daughter in such a violent and uncertain manner caused immense grief, leaving a void that could not easily be filled. Rochelle's siblings also struggled through years of sorrow, constantly facing unanswered questions about what happened and why. The 2023 conviction of Darren Fuller brought a degree of justice and accountability, yet it did little to heal the emotional wounds caused by the loss. Without the recovery of Rochelle's body, the family has been denied the closure that comes from a proper burial. The absence of her remains prolongs the mourning process, preventing them from fully reconciling with the tragedy. Despite this, the family holds on to hope that one day Rochelle's body will be found, allowing her to be laid to rest with her unborn child, Amir, whom she had been eagerly awaiting. Rochelle's story stands as a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the enduring consequences of violence. Her family's resilience in the face of profound loss highlights their commitment to seeking justice and preserving her memory. While her life and the life of her child were cut tragically short, the determination of her loved ones ensures that Rochelle's story will not be forgotten. Through grief, hope, and the pursuit of justice, the family continues to honor her legacy.